The ancient Punic Empire of Carthage was a polity that was the dominating entity of the Mediterranean from around 814 to 416 BCE. They laid the foundation before Rome rose to prominence and established a lasting empire, starting small from the period of kings to its imperial days, lasting until approximately 476 CE, at least in the west. After the First, Second, and Third Punic Wars, Carthage was defeated and the Roman Republic replaced it as the dominating power, but not before many of their achievements and findings were almost thoroughly destroyed by the Romans. Luckily, a lot of their pieces, although fragmented, still live on through second-hand reports, artifacts, and accounts of surrounding cultures they had contact with, ally and enemy alike, so we can piece together what their empire was like. The name Carthage comes from the Phoenician language, and it stands for new city or new town. The people of Carthage were known as Carthaginians. They were a Phoenician people hailing from the Levant, making them Semitic in origin. Before they set up numerous colonies, they ran independent city-states on the coast of the Levant like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos in modern-day Lebanon, and from there they expanded, extending westward as far as colonizing a portion of Spain, known then as Iberia. They mastered the field of naval trading and quickly grew wealthy from it, while connecting the far reaches through trade routes they founded starting from the late 9th century BCE. Despite being Semitic in origin, the Carthaginian Empire was centralized in northern Africa, specifically where present-day Tunisia is. The reason for this location for Carthage being there is strictly strategic. It gives them easy access to territories in the Mediterranean, allowing ships, both foreign and domestic, to enter and exit the port from all around. What made Carthage as powerful as they were in their day was the coastal nature of their empire. Whoever controls the shared mass of any different states controls the flow of trade and commerce in the region. By originating as merchants willing to sail to several parts of the Mediterranean, Carthage quickly expanded and enjoyed the fruits of their accumulated labor. At the height of their empire in the 4th century BCE, Carthage controlled much of the interstate ports like Cadiz, Utica, and Annaba, using the presence of Carthaginian ships and merchants to oversee the flow of trade. During the late Bronze Age collapse, most of the trading juggernauts of the past, like the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, and many more, fell into disarray. And while Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, their territorial and economic strength receded greatly by the time it was over. No one had seen such a large-scale fall of entire civilizations. Or they eventually capitalized on the effects of the Bronze Age collapse by filling in the void left by old trading giants. The Phoenicians were already regular trading partners with many Greek city-states, building mutual trust over the years. Around 1200 BCE, when the Bronze Age collapse was starting to hit the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians weathered it well, eventually emerging as a dominating naval power based in the city of Sorrento in modern-day Lebanon, using their previous experience at trading to build the foundations of what would later become an entire empire. What kind of ships did Carthage use to explore new lands and control the flow of trade throughout several territories? They used shallow draughted galleys called pentaconters that consisted of a single row of 50 rowers. Eventually, they evolved into the larger triremes and quadremes that had 3 and 4 rows of oars respectively, which the Greeks and Romans would eventually adopt themselves and tweak in later years. These ships acted as both merchant and war vessels and emphasized maneuverability. Their hollow hulls and shallow drafts on top of being built out of light wood like oak and cypress made them fast and light but strong enough to use their rams to sink enemy ships. Some sources say that at their peak, Carthage's fleet controlled up to approximately 350 of these ships. How could Carthage create such a massive fleet? Well, there's evidence of them implementing a system of cutting wood into separate uniform pieces and sizes. Some were marked with numbers, so the builders had the ability to mass produce such large and effective ships suitable for trading, exploration, and naval battle. Let's look at the shipwreck called the Marsala Punic shipwreck, dating back to around the 3rd century BCE. The wreck was found in 1971 off the coast of western Sicily by the late archaeologist Honor Frost and measured to be approximately 25 to 30 meters in length. Punic markings were found on different parts of the ship, like the hull and keel, which indicated methods of its construction, providing evidence that these ships were prefabricated and had a standardized building process. This breakthrough in figuring out naval construction was revolutionary, not only in the idea of mass production itself, but also partially lets us in on how Carthage was able to expand so quickly. To house such a large fleet of ships at the height of their power, the city of Carthage had a port called the Grand Harbor. It was among other Punic cities. These circular harbors were called cotons. Though the Grand Harbor at Carthage is the most famous example, others existed in Cyprus and Sicily. Oppian of Alexandria was a Greek historian with Roman citizenship who lived during the time of the early years of the Roman Empire. While he talks about Carthage centuries after its fall, he's considered to be a reliable source, as he was critical of some of the sources he would use and complained about them being incomplete. He was also invested in how the Roman civil wars unfolded, specifically on their purpose in the first place. Because of this, Oppian's accounts are some of the most reliable sources on parts of Roman history, despite having a bias in favor of Rome. What he wrote about the harbor lines up well with what we currently know about how the empire traded as a whole. Here's what he said about the great harbor of Carthage. The harbors had communication with each other and had a common entrance from the sea 20 meters wide, which would be closed with iron chains. First port was for merchant vessels, and here were collected all kinds of ships' tackle. The second port was an island, which together with the port itself was enclosed by high embankments. These embankments were full of shipyards, which had the capacity for 220 vessels. Some of them were magazines for their tackle and furniture. Town and columns stood in front of each dock, giving the appearance of a continuous portico to both the harbor and the island. On the island was built the admiral's house, from which the trumpeter gave signals, the herald delivered orders, and the admiral himself overlooked everything. The island lay near the entrance to the harbor and rose to considerable height, so that the admiral could observe what was going on at sea, while those who were approaching by water could not get any clear view of what took place within. Not even incoming merchants could see the docks, for a double wall enclosed them, and there were gates which merchant ships could pass the port and the city without traversing the dockyards. It's impossible to build an empire without some use of force. We can look at almost any aspect of Roman life to see that there were absolute masters of military expansion and control, especially on land. But they had to have learned it from somewhere. The Carthaginians rarely wore armor, specifically in the early days of their expansion. There's archaeological evidence to show the various weapons, from swords to maces and spears made of iron, but little remains of armor that dates to their earliest years. At the start of their more serious expansions, many forces consisted of conscripted citizens, resulting in numerous deaths from lack of protection. But what little defense they had, they made up for with the use of the composite bow, with an average firing range of 150 to 200 meters, or approximately 500 feet. Numerous archers firing at once would devastate enemy numbers. But by the late 3rd century BCE, the Carthaginians expanded, not to just include auxiliaries to minimize their native Punic citizens from military deaths in territories they conquered, but like the Iberians in Spain and Libyans, with the famous example being the use of the Balearic slingers from the Balearic Islands, who were prized mercenaries for the Carthaginians who could use their slings to lob devastating projectiles as far as 400 meters. They also incorporated arms and battle strategies from the foreign civilizations they had regular contact with, namely Greeks, Samnites, Lucanians, and Romans. Other times, they've looted it from battles they won in the past. In Qusur Esef in Tunisia, there's a Punic tomb that held a bronze breastplate almost identical to the type used by the Italics that dates roughly to the 3rd century BCE. And if we look at pottery depicting a soldier wearing armor reminiscent of the Samnites in central Italy, also dated around the same time, we could see how similarly they were equipped. The average Carthaginian mercenary fighting as infantry would be equipped rather lightly to accommodate the North African heat, while emulating armor typically favored by the Greek hoplites, mostly utilizing lenothorax. Most of Carthage's infantry consisted of mercenaries from all around their trade routes, from the Iberians and Balearic slingers from Spain and Portugal to even the Gauls. Accounts by Greek historian Polybius are often the most reliable sources about the Punic Wars, and he writes, "The Africans were armed in the Roman fashion, Hannibal having equipped them with the choicest of arms captured in the previous battles. Such captured weaponry replaced in part that given the Carthaginians by Bronius, appointed by Hannibal as leader of the Allobroges before the passage of the Alps. These weapons, which replaced Carthaginian equipment, had become worn with age, were definitely of the Celtic type." It's important to remember, however, that the best evidence about the Carthaginian military was written by their enemies, as none of their own seem to have survived Roman destruction. Around the 6th to 5th century BCE, 2 Carthaginian explorers named Hanno and Himilco the Navigators sought to explore past the borders of Carthage to expand territory and trade outposts past the Pillars of Heracles, or the Strait of Gibraltar, in between today's Spanish and Moroccan borders. Their actual periplus remain lost due to Carthage's destruction, but an abridged translation of Hanno's work in Greek is still readable to us. Hanno's expedition took him southward, further into Africa. Hugging the coast, he set up numerous colonies and met native tribes, some of which could act as translators as semi-nomadic Lixitai. The Carthaginians met near the river Lixus, which may be the Drava River today. They founded another outpost on an island and called it Cerne, probably where the Bay of Argan is today. Further down south, as the lands would become more unfamiliar and mountainous, he would eventually meet more natives, said to be wearing animal skins, and according to Hanno, they would be unreceptive upon their arrival, throwing stones at his ships to prevent them from landing. He later came across vast rivers where crocodiles and hippopotamus roamed, woods full of lush, fragrant trees, and fire that would flow into the sea, where in the middle a large volley would be tossed into the air, touching the stars. By day, it revealed to be a volcano, which he would name the Chariot of the Gods. Due to the vagueness of the location, he may have been describing Mount Cameroon. At the last recorded place Hanno landed on, he and his crew were probably the first to have discovered gorillas, as he described them having hairy bodies, matching what we know about gorillas and other apes. Though they may not have discovered gorillas at all, but probably another type of great ape, as he also said that they climbed to get away from them, which gorillas can do, but threw stones at Hanno and his men, which is something gorillas don't often do. They might not have discovered some other type of great ape like chimpanzees, since they are climbers, they throw in self-defense and to display dominance, and when they attack humans, they scratch and bite, all of which the Periplus mentions. The reason most people think they were the first to discover gorillas was because of the interpreters on the voyage called them gorillas, and the explorers who discovered and named actual gorillas in the mid-19th century likely used this name from the Periplus to identify them. As stated before, Himilco was another explorer who sought to seek trade routes for valuable resources, specifically tin. But instead of sailing southward further into Africa, he sailed northward into the European coast with the goal of finding the Tin Islands. Tin was an extremely valuable material in antiquity because it could be fused with copper to make long-lasting, corrosive-resistant tools and arms, and Himilco set out to find a place where tin was produced widely so it could be acquired cheaper, as opposed to buying it from the last in a series of middlemen. Unfortunately, Himilco's writings never survived, but he was referenced throughout Rome's rule, with the oldest being Roman natural philosopher Pliny the Elder in his Natural Histories. He was also quoted 3 times by Roman writer Rufius Festus Avienus in his Ora Maritima. He may have achieved his goal in finding the place to buy tin from, as there's evidence of Venetian settlement in the tin-rich area of Portugal and southwestern Spain. A tribe known as the Carthaginians were highly active in the region and were particularly skilled in metallurgy, where materials had an abundance of other tin were silver, lead, and copper. Hanno and Himilco's accounts make it difficult to match where they may have been today due to their vagueness and translation difficulties. Hanno's log specifically ends abruptly after leaving the island he apparently discovered gorillas on. Historians theorize that this vagueness was intentional on Carthage's part, so their enemies couldn't find trade routes to these places, as Carthage was very protective of their sphere of trade. As Rome started as a minor town in central Italy, they too had the same expansionist attitude as Carthage, absorbing the rest of the civilizations on the peninsula, like the Etruscans in the late 3rd century BCE. Carthage became aware of this growing enemy, as the conquest under their belt would prove to be a looming threat like none other they'd seen. The Greeks fought similarly to Carthage in previous battles and emulated each other in arms and strategies, but the Romans were clever. When they found a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme on Messana, they reverse-engineered it, using the core design for their own fleet to turn the tide of the future. The Romans knew the very thing that helped build the Carthaginian Empire was one of the many keys, like higher population and good military discipline, to spell out their end. Punic Wars broke out, a series of battles on 3 different occasions between the 2 giants of the Mediterranean that lasted from 264 to 146 BCE. When the wars concluded, the Romans laid siege to the city of Carthage itself, making its destruction nigh apocalyptic, as what we know about Carthage are mostly second-hand accounts from their enemies and people they traded with. The Carthaginian Empire picked up the fractures and rose from the ashes of the late Bronze Age collapse and fell into obscurity under the might of the Romans, who then went on to establish their own hegemony over the Mediterranean, expanding their reach much farther than Carthage ever did, before it too eventually fell after almost a rule of over 1,000 years.